Here's an overview of how to write the first draft of Writing Project 1, the rhetorical analysis. Remember that the rhetorical analysis is primarily made up of two different parts. First, you'll need to write a summary that accurately summarizes the author's message and main points. And you'll also need to write an analysis. In the analysis section, you'll be analyzing how the author relays the information they're trying to relay to their target audience. Also in that section, you'll need to consider whether or not the author's choices are rhetorically effective. Ultimately, your summary portion is going to function as your introduction. Because it's functioning as your introduction, you're going to want to take the time to fully introduce and familiarize your own audience with your text. In order to familiarize your own audience with the text, you'll want to include the first and last name of your author as you introduce them. But then, after you've introduced them, for the rest of your paper, you can just refer to them by their last name. You'll also want to include the full title of your chosen chapter from Bad Ideas About Writing so that your audience knows what text exactly you're summarizing. It's also important in your summary that you demonstrate an understanding of your chosen chapter as a rhetorical situation. And remember, the three main components of any rhetorical situation are that text's genre, target audience, and the author's purpose in writing. So make sure you briefly define those moving parts as well. Of course, you'll also want to summarize the author's thesis as well as any additional main points that they make throughout their chapter. After you've identified the target audience expectations, values, and beliefs, most importantly, you'll want to consider whether or not the author's rhetorical choices effectively deliver their points. And your answer to this particular question is your thesis for this rhetorical analysis. Let's pause here for a second to make sure that we all have an understanding of your chapter as a rhetorical situation. So regardless of which chapter you choose, the genre of any of these chapters is a scholarly article. We know that it's a scholarly article because it's published in an academic, peer-reviewed book, where other professionals in the field have taken the time to comb through this piece, Bad Ideas About Writing, as a whole, and they have made sure that the information is accurate, contemporary, and important. When you're attempting to define the audience of any piece, consider who exactly is buying Bad Ideas About Writing. Based on your reading of your chapter, who does your author seem to be writing to? To be very blunt, who cares about this particular topic? Who would be interested in the purpose of what the author is trying to say? And then finally, when you're attempting to describe the author's purpose, think about the author's goals in their chapter. For example, are they explaining a new concept? Are they trying to persuade their target audience of something? These are questions that you should all consider in your summary portion. As is true with any piece of academic writing, your thesis statement in your rhetorical analysis is the most important sentence of your paper. It should fully encapsulate the main ideas of your own rhetorical analysis. I realize that most of you have probably written some kind of thesis before, and many instructors have different ways of teaching the writing of a thesis, but I like to stick with a three-part approach. When you're approaching writing a thesis, I think it's important to cover three things. Who is doing what, and why are they doing that thing? For the purposes of this assignment, the thesis should be the last sentence of your first paragraph, which is your summary paragraph. And at the sentence level, your language in your thesis should be very clear. What I mean by that is your word choice should be specific, and your subjects and verbs should be both accurate and strong. Remember that an effective thesis for a rhetorical analysis should tell us who is doing what and why, and should also tell us whether or not the author's choices are rhetorically effective given their target audience's values, expectations, and opinions. So let's look at this first example. Jones effectively convinces his audience of whatever Jones's thesis is through the use of statistics and surveys paired with emotional stories. This is an effective thesis. Number one, We have the who, Jones. We have a what, Jones effectively convinces his audience. And then we have a breakdown of how exactly Jones effectively convinces his audience through the lens of rhetorical appeals. Specifically, this author takes note of Jones's use of statistics and surveys, what we would refer to as logos, because this is Jones's usage of good logical reasoning skills. And then they also say that this use of logos specifically paired with emotional stories. So this author is saying that Jones's use of both logos and pathos is successful given Jones's target audience. You'll also notice that the language throughout this thesis, which is a fairly short thesis, is clear and strong. After you've written the summary portion of your rhetorical analysis and you've come up with a thesis that you think successfully encapsulates your main ideas, then you're ready to get started on the analysis portion. I recommend planning to write at least 4 support paragraphs for your analysis portion, and here's a breakdown of what I think is the most successful way to go about choosing those 4 support paragraphs. I recommend identifying 4 of the most significant rhetorical appeals in your chosen chapter. So you could have, for instance, 1 support paragraph about ethos, 1 support paragraph about logos, 1 about organization, 1 about style, etc. And plan to write your support paragraphs, especially your topic sentences, about those most significant rhetorical appeals. Of course, if you think that your author's rhetorical choices are perhaps not as successful as they could have been, and you feel like you have a lot of feedback and suggestions as to how that chapter could have been more rhetorically effective, you can take your 4th and final support paragraph and devote that paragraph solely to your own suggestions. So you do have a little bit of creative freedom here. After you've zeroed in on which rhetorical choices you want to focus your support paragraphs on and you're ready to flesh out those support paragraphs, here's a sentence-by-sentence model that can help you write this analysis portion. I also think that this model works for a variety of other kinds of academic writing, so this might be something that you want to use in the future as well. I refer to it as the pi plus t repeating model. And this model ultimately breaks down how exactly you should move through support paragraphs. Our P stands for point because you always want to start a support paragraph with a strong topic sentence. This topic sentence should represent the main idea of that particular paragraph, and it should also relate in some way to your thesis. Your topic sentences ultimately should create a kind of through line throughout your paper, meaning that if all a reader was seeing from your paper was your thesis and your support paragraph topic sentences, the main ideas of your paper should still make sense. In order to support those topic sentences, you'll want to include our I, which stands for illustration. Within the context of support paragraphs, illustration refers to some kind of textual evidence. These can be quotes or paraphrases, whichever one you think is most effective for demonstrating the idea that you're trying to prove to your reader. And of course, pieces of textual evidence, be they quotes or paraphrases, should always be accompanied by correct in-text citations. After you've provided sufficient textual evidence, you'll want to take the time to explain the connection between the textual evidence to your topic sentence. And this stage is very important. You need to connect the dots for your reader. You need to hold their hand through your close reading of your chapter. Don't leave anything up for the reader's assumption. This is the section of your support paragraph where you should really be driving home and elaborating your own analysis and critique. After you've sufficiently explained your point through the usage of textual evidence and your own close reading, then you'll want to transition to the next support paragraph. Take a step back and ask yourself, okay, when I was making the outline for this analysis portion, why did I decide to put these two ideas next to one another? What's the connection between them? Ultimately, the function of the transition is to make that connection explicit to your reader. After you've written at least 4 support paragraphs for your analysis section, then you're ready to wrap up your ideas with a very short conclusion paragraph. I recommend that for this paper, your conclusion paragraph be between 100 and 150 words. You don't necessarily need to go on for super long here. I do recommend that the first sentence of your conclusion paragraph should be some version of your restated thesis. Remind your reader, again, holding their hand, connecting the dots, of the ultimate thesis of your paper. For the rest of your conclusion, if you haven't already, made some suggestions as to how the author could have made their chapter a little bit more rhetorically effective, you could do that with the space you have here. If you've chosen to make that rhetorical move in one of your support paragraphs, then I recommend that you zoom out from your text itself, your chapter itself, and you take a few sentences to discuss the importance of projects like the chapter you have chosen. This can mean discussing the importance of first-year writing as a whole, of the author's particular topic, whatever you think is most appropriate, and whatever you think will be most appealing to your own target audience, which, remember, is your English 106 peers. And then, after you've written your summary, your thesis statement, your 4 support paragraphs for your analysis portion, and you've wrapped it all up with a conclusion, congratulations, you have finished the first draft of your rhetorical analysis.